Hold on to your seats, tennis royalty, because the tea I am about to spill today is so scorching hot it is practically melting the court. Welcome back to Courtside Zone, your ultimate VIP pass to the wildest, most unfiltered stories in the tennis universe. It is your girl Aryna, and today we are diving into a story so massive, so unprecedented, and so deeply emotional that it has literally left the reigning queen of the WTA in tears. I am not talking about a scandalous locker room fight, and I am certainly not talking about a shocking upset on the clay. No, my friends, today we are talking about a boardroom deal, a staggering amount of generational wealth, and a single piece of paper that just fundamentally shattered the entire established order of women's professional tennis. Make sure you are sitting down for this one, because a Philippine billionaire just slid a number across a table that altered reality. We are talking about $500,000 every single month for life. And the craziest part? It is not even for the player. It is for her parents. Let that sink in for a moment. But before we get to the billionaire, the money, and the exact moment Aryna Sabalenka found out and completely broke down sobbing, we have to rewind. Because to truly understand the absolute earthquake this has caused on the tour, you have to understand where Eala came from. Long before the roaring stadium crowds, before the viral highlight reels, and way before any billionaire ever uttered her family's name. There was just a small girl in Manila with a borrowed racket and a dream so utterly enormous that it frankly embarrassed the people around her who didn't have the vision to believe in it. Eala did not arrive in the pristine, privileged world of professional tennis on a silver platter. Let me be completely real with you guys. Tennis is a rich kid's sport. It just is. But Alex arrived through layers of compounding sacrifice, built entirely on the quiet, back-breaking dignity of two parents who gave absolutely everything without ever once asking for a single thing in return. Her father, Michael, is an architect who completely restructured his entire professional existence around his daughter's scheduling. Her mother, Ricky, became a full-time traveler, manager, organizer, and logistical genius, pouring every ounce of her soul into nurturing a champion. And here is my personal opinion on this. I genuinely believe that people do not talk enough about the absolute financial nightmare that is raising a tennis prodigy. This detail matters enormously because what separates Eala's journey from almost every other elite prospect on the tour right now isn't just her lethal forehand or her court coverage. It is the fact that she ascended to the top despite a glaring, structural disadvantage that would have permanently bankrupted and ended the careers of lesser players. The Philippines, with all its incredible passion, does not operate with the same limitless tennis federation resources as Spain, the United States, or Russia. There are no automatic, carpeted pathways. There are no guaranteed funding pipelines or massive government-backed development academies just blindly funneling millions into junior prodigies. What existed instead was the Eala family functioning as a rogue, one-unit support system. They absorbed the astronomical costs. They swallowed the terrifying uncertainty. They trusted a trajectory they absolutely could not guarantee. And it worked. Eala entered the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, arguably the most elite, pressure cooker developmental environment in global tennis, and she didn't just survive the grind. She dominated it. She became the very first Filipino to win a Grand Slam junior title when she captured the 2022 U.S. Open Girls Singles crown. It was a moment so profoundly stunning that seasoned tennis analysts literally had to pause, rewind the broadcast footage, and rub their eyes to make sure they hadn't misread the scoreboard. But they hadn't. Eala was real. Her meteoric rise was real. And the suffocating financial pressure her family absorbed behind the scenes to make that rise possible was very, very real. Here is what the casual tennis fans tuning in on Sundays never consider. Behind every extraordinary athlete swinging a racket on your television screen is an extraordinary financial gamble. Coaching fees, international travel expenses, specialized equipment costs, exorbitant tournament entry fees, and accommodations across multiple continents. For families without institutional backing, every single year of pursuing elite professional tennis is a sustained act of sheer economic courage. The Eala family made that terrifying choice repeatedly, without any fanfare, without any public recognition, just quiet, relentless grinding. This context is absolutely essential, guys, because when a prominent Philippine billionaire eventually stepped out of the shadows with an offer that would permanently dissolve that crushing financial burden, the announcement didn't just change the circumstances of one family. It fired a blinding flare into the night sky, signaling to the entire sport that a brand new power structure was emerging. A structure that didn't require Alex Eala to beg for federation funding or negotiate predatory sponsorship terms from a position of desperation, or quietly accept unfavorable branding arrangements simply because she had no other alternatives to pay her travel bills. Her parents had given everything. Now, somebody with extraordinary, world-altering resources looked at everything they had given and decided, unconditionally, that it deserved a permanent reward. But before that mind-blowing moment arrived, there was a rivalry that was actively brewing on the courts. There was a champion who had to be confronted. There was a name spoken and hushed, intimidated whispers in locker rooms and broadcast booths across the WTA circuit, a name that Eala would eventually have to walk toward rather than run away from. That name was Aryna Sabalenka, and the collision course between these two women, one an established, terrifying force of nature and the other a rapidly ascending prodigy, was about to set the stage for the most dramatic sequence of events I have ever seen in this sport. Let's talk about Aryna for a second. Sabalenka is constructed differently than almost anyone else who has ever picked up a racket. And I don't just mean physically, though her serve velocity and terrifying baseline aggression place her in a stratosphere most opponents can't even fathom. I mean psychologically. This is a woman who has navigated profound personal tragedy, relentless public criticism, intense geopolitical controversy surrounding her Belarusian identity, and the highly specific, agonizing cruelty of losing multiple Grand Slam finals before she finally managed to convert her dominance into major titles. She is not fragile. She has earned the absolute right to be considered unbreakable, which is exactly why the growing whispers about Alex Eala made the world number one stop and pay attention. In the cutthroat world of professional tennis, dominant champions do not publicly acknowledge threats. It is the golden rule. It violates the psychological architecture of sustained dominance. Acknowledging that an opponent is dangerous instantly grants them power. Sabalenka, across her entire legendary career, had completely mastered the art of visible indifference. She would acknowledge opponents just enough to show basic professional respect, and then she would step onto the court and methodically dismantle them limb by limb. But Alex Eala represented something entirely different, something Sabalenka had never encountered in quite this way before. It wasn't just Eala's ranking progress, even though that trajectory was undeniably steep and accelerating at a terrifying pace. It wasn't just her baseline consistency or her uncanny capacity to absorb Sabalenka's heavy pace and redirect it with precision. It was where Eala came from and what her emergence represented at a macro level. Women's tennis has, for decades, been largely dominated by players from a relatively narrow set of national pipelines. Russia, Belarus, the United States, the Czech Republic, Romania. Sure, exceptional outliers existed, but they were almost always quickly absorbed into the existing, wealthy structures. They trained in European academies, they adapted to established systems, they played the game the way the system demanded. Eala wasn't adapting to the system. She was arriving with the full, undeniable cultural weight of an entire nation's sporting hunger right behind her. And she was arriving with a fan base whose devotion operated at a fever pitch that veteran WTA insiders found genuinely startling. Filipino supporters didn't just engage with Eala's matches the way typical tennis fans engage. They mobilized. They went to war. Social media takeovers, massive stadium attendance, highly organized viewing parties across the globe, it was a collective emotional investment that transformed every single Eala match into something resembling a national referendum. Sabalenka noticed. Trust me, players at her level notice absolutely everything. Behind closed doors, in private conversations that only leaked through whispers and secondhand accounts, members of Sabalenka's inner circle began flagging Eala's development with increasing urgency. The serve wasn't the primary problem. The footwork wasn't the main issue. The situation itself was the problem. Because Eala wasn't approaching the summit of women's tennis as an individual underdog story. She was approaching it as a full-blown movement. And movements, unlike individual opponents on a Sunday afternoon, cannot be broken by a few heavy cross-court forehands. When their paths finally crossed on the match courts, the dynamic between them carried an electric charge that standard WTA rivalries rarely ever generate. Sabalenka brought power, battle-tested experience, and the institutional authority of a proven, feared champion. Eala brought hunger, pinpoint precision, and the almost dangerous, intoxicating freedom of a player who had absolutely nothing left to prove to the doubters who had already been proven completely wrong. You could feel it in the air. The spectators felt it. The broadcasters felt it. The entire WTA felt it. But what absolutely nobody fully anticipated was the external, off-court force that was about to violently intervene in this brewing rivalry. It wasn't another player. It wasn't a controversial federation decision. It wasn't a scandal generated on the court. It was a man, a Philippine businessman whose vast wealth was so substantial and whose genuine admiration for what the Eala family represented was so profound that he decided the time for politely watching from the sidelines had permanently expired. He was about to change the game forever. Honestly, the specific name of the individual involved matters far less than the sheer magnitude of what he proposed. A highly prominent Philippine businessman, deeply connected across massive industries with a sprawling fortune built across real estate, telecommunications, and regional financial markets, reportedly approached the Eala family through a series of intermediaries. And guys, he did not come with an endorsement arrangement. He did not come with a standard sponsorship contract contingent on Eala hitting specific rankings or performance milestones. He didn't approach them with the cold, calculated commercial logic that typically governs athlete-sponsor relationships in this industry. He proposed something categorically, fundamentally different. $500,000 per month. Unconditionally. For life. Deposited directly to Alex Eala's parents. Read that again. Not as payment for services rendered, not as leverage to control her schedule, not as a cynical mechanism to influence her career decisions or extract maximum promotional value for his corporate brands, simply as recognition, as a pure, unadulterated acknowledgement that Michael and Ricky Eala had made an extraordinary, crushing sacrifice across many years, and that their sacrifice deserved a permanent, unconditional reward. The offer, by any reasonable metric or analysis, was completely unprecedented in Philippine sporting history and quite possibly unprecedented in the broader history of global tennis sponsorship arrangements. It defied every established commercial template. It didn't require complex legal frameworks governing performance triggers or mandatory marketing deliverables. It was, in its purest essence, an act of profound, staggering personal generosity from someone who had watched the Eala family's grueling journey with sustained admiration, decided that admiration had a price tag, and realized he was more than willing to pay it indefinitely. When word of this mind-bending arrangement began circulating, first through exclusive Philippine business networks, then bleeding into sports media, and finally exploding across international tennis coverage, the reaction was immediate, deafening, and highly polarizing. Some observers and pundits celebrated it as exactly the kind of massive structural investment that Philippine sports, and arguably global tennis, had always desperately needed. Others immediately started questioning the psychological implications. They asked whether unconditional external wealth of that magnitude might alter Eala's internal motivational architecture. They wondered if completely removing financial pressure from her family might subtly, invisibly kill the desperate urgency that had powered her meteoric ascent in the first place. And let me tell you, these were legitimate, fascinating conversations to have, even if a lot of the people having them were clearly doing so with a barely disguised, elitist discomfort at the sheer scale of the gesture. But the reaction that absolutely nobody anticipated, the reaction that genuinely stunned the entire global tennis community to its core when the details finally leaked, came from Aryna Sabalenka. Sabalenka, a woman who had meticulously built her champion's identity partly on the compelling narrative of absolute self-sufficiency, of violently fighting through adversity without ever relying on institutional rescue, of achieving greatness through sheer, terrifying force of will and endless preparation, processed the news about Eala's family with a complexity of emotion that her fierce public persona almost never displayed. Sources incredibly close to her camp described the situation to the press very carefully. They made it clear this was not jealousy. Let's be real, Sabalenka's financial position as one of the WTA's highest global earners made the purely monetary dimension of the offer completely irrelevant to her personal life. It also wasn't a resentment of Eala specifically. Their professional relationship actually carried a deep, mutual respect vibrating right beneath the intense competitive fire. What truly affected Sabalenka, what broke through her armor, was something far more profound and much less easily articulated by the talking heads on sports television. It was the sudden, heavy recognition that Eala's support structure had just become invincible. It was the realization that the underlying financial vulnerability, the quiet desperation which sometimes creates crushing psychological pressure in athletes from under-resourced backgrounds, had just been eliminated entirely from Eala's equation. The competitive landscape had shifted violently beneath her feet, not on a scoreboard in a third set, not through a weekly ranking adjustment, but through a single, private financial arrangement between a billionaire and a family who had suffered without complaint for years. The champion who feared absolutely nothing on a tennis court sat alone with this newly discovered information and felt, perhaps for the very first time in an incredibly long time, something that closely resembled genuine uncertainty about the future. And then she cried. She didn't do it publicly initially, but the tears came. And once the news of that highly vulnerable, private moment inevitably reached the ravenous press, everything accelerated dramatically. You see, the tennis community has a very peculiar, almost hypocritical relationship with emotion. Players are endlessly celebrated for passion when it is expressed strictly within the confines of match contexts. The aggressive fist pumps, the primal roars, the dramatic emotional post-victory breakdowns on the clay. But raw vulnerability outside of competition, particularly from a player positioned as a dominant, intimidating champion, carries an entirely different weight. It instantly becomes headline news. It becomes a narrative to be dissected. It becomes the center of a swirling conversation that moves far beyond the baseline of the sport itself. When the reports surfaced that Sabalenka had been visibly, deeply emotional upon learning the full scope of the Eala arrangement, that she had literally sobbed in a private setting, the interpretation machine went into overdrive immediately. Tennis analysts debated endlessly on podcasts about what the tears actually meant. Social media divided aggressively, drawing battle lines along completely predictable factions. Filipino supporters, completely understandably, treated the news as the ultimate validation, undeniable proof that Eala's trajectory was now so terrifyingly significant that even the sport's reigning, unbreakable power had been moved by its implications. Sabalenka's hardcore supporters pushed back furiously, arguing that the tears were being maliciously mischaracterized by the media, that her private emotional moments deserved protection from cheap public speculation, and that reducing a multi-time Grand Slam champion to a mere reaction to a rival's financial fortunes was reductive, sexist, and profoundly unfair. Honestly, both sides contained genuine truth. The discourse, as tennis discourse so frequently becomes, was vastly more complicated than its loudest, most toxic participants were willing to acknowledge. But what got somewhat lost in the deafening noise of the takes and the tweets was the deeply human dimension of Sabalenka's response. Those who actually knew her well, her former coaches, her longtime training partners, the rare individuals whose professional proximity gave them actual access to who Aryna was beneath the competitive exterior, suggested that her emotion wasn't actually about Eala at all.